Every day I wake up in the morning and nothing gets me more excited than changing the same pixel values 20 times in a row to make me feel like I'm doing a huge valuable service to mankind. And since you guys are CSS experts according to my community post, I want to fulfill your lifelong ambition of becoming a CSS rockstar. In this CSS layout guide, it's not about explaining every possible CSS property and value, because there are a ton of resources out there that can tell you how to do that. However, I want to mention how you should approach and think in CSS so that your CSS isn't chaos like our social abilities as an engineer. Now, this works with any kind of CSS library, post-processors, or components, or anything you can think of, because it's more about the approach. Now, there's some rare articles that will explain what I'm talking about, but I want to cover that in the video and go further on how you can approach every little step. So when you are given a design that you need to implement with CSS, the very first thing you should be doing is visualizing everything in terms of boxes. And to start with, we want to talk about the CSS box model. So the CSS box model represents all the layers a single box. So we include content, padding, border, and margin. And by default, CSS sets everything to be content box, which only includes content. So that represents one element. But if you set it to border box, you include the padding and the border. So once you understand the box model, now we can split our layout into different blocks. And we want to be able to visualize every element on the page as a block. As you can see here, we start from the outside and then we go inside. And we always start from the top and we go horizontally. We don't go vertically because divs naturally stack on top of each other. So we want to make sure we start horizontally, splitting the elements into different blocks. Now, for example, if you take the YouTube landing page, we can toggle this Chrome extension, which will allow us to see all the elements on this page as different boxes. So if you hover over this, we see the nav bar. We have another box over here, and here, as well as each of the videos are a box in itself. And now you can imagine if you're using a framework, visualizing these boxes also helps set up the components that you would need for something like React, Vue, Angular, or Svelte. So these components are perfect for those boxes. And as we've seen with some of the layouts, some of the most important things to understand is that everything has a parent-child relationship. So every element here has both a parent and a child. And that parent-child relationships will be very key to understanding how we can use Flexbox and Grid for a lot of our layouts. Now, visualizing our layouts via blocks really helps set the foundation and the structure of our entire CSS code. And that helps us utilize a very important tool that we know as Flexbox. Now, there are several tools for positioning things on the website, but the number one tool you should always reach for is going to be Flexbox. There's another tool called Float that you can use to position things, but it is the outdated way of positioning, and you should only use it if you like suffering. Now, when it comes to Flexbox versus absolute positioning, a lot of people tend to use absolute positioning as their default method, which I believe is a basic mistake. And there are a few reasons why. First off, it's harder on responsive design. For example, if you have something that's set to 150 pixel from the right side of the screen, it's going to be in a very drastically different position for a screen of 3000 pixels versus a mobile screen which is 300 pixel, where 150 pixel from the right would be in the center. And on top of that, that leads to you designing in a specific pixel perfect manner, which is not ideal. Now, there's a bigger reason why you should always use Flexbox versus absolute positioning, and that's because Flexbox does not disturb the flow of the layout. What that means is that if you take a look at this layout and you look at this nav bar, every item is in relation to each other. For example, this item is related to this because they're on the same line and they're kind of positioned to the right. However, if you take a look at this nighttime icon and you remove it, what happens is none of these other items move, which is not ideal. Sometimes you do not want this big of a space between these two items. And let's actually also take out this profile. And now we just have a big gap between these items, and this requires us to position this and move this over here, which is quite a hassle. In contrast, let's look at Flexbox. We have these items again, and let's see what happens when we take out the settings icon. We can see that this has been moved over along with this. And then let's actually take out the profile icon. And again, as you can see, it's been moved aligned over here. So it's very easy to have it set up in a way that we would like. Our lives are way easier because we are following the flow of the layout. They have a relationship where with the other positions of each item is. So even in the search bar, this is positioned to the right of this along with the search, which is on the left side. So there's always this flow dynamic with a lot of items on the page. And for that reason, having Flexbox is way easier to maintain. If you've ever tried to fix up a code base where everything's absolutely positioned, you'll start to realize this becomes a nightmare to maintain because you have to constantly calculate pixels and place things in different locations. Flexbox is the ideal tool when it comes to most applications and most websites. Now, Flexbox has a lot of properties going on with it, but there's actually only a few properties that you really need to know. And it's very important to understand that parent-child relationships I mentioned before, because you're going to use different properties on the parent element of all the children in Flexbox. So the parent attributes are going to have all of these properties you see here, but the ones that we concern ourselves is just going to be display, justify content, and align items. These three properties are the only properties that you really need to know. And even with justify content and align items, there's only a few properties of each of those. When you're using Flexbox, it is very handy to have a cheat sheet at your disposal. You can utilize this to see and visualize what these properties are doing. And justify content is going to be the most commonly used Flexbox parent property that you will need to use. And justify content aligns the items or the children in a horizontal direction, or whichever direction is the default. So we have flex start, flex end, center, space between, and then space around. So space between, space around, center are the most common, and then occasionally you will use flex start, flex end. And then the second most commonly used alignment is going to be align content, which is pretty much the same thing as justify content, but it's going to align things vertically. So we have flex start, flex end, center, space between, and space around. The most commonly one you're going to be using is going to be center, because a lot of times we're just going to align one horizontal line. So even in a basic example, you can see that this is flex right here. And then we're using space between for this particular div, spacing everything out. And then same thing over here. This is another parent. And then these are the child with these navigation items. And these are doing space between. Note that up here, we're also vertically aligning them. So we're using align content center. So this is one of the most common ways you can use Flex to set up your layouts. And now there's another property you can use flex wrap, but I'm going to show you ways so that you don't ever need to use flex wrap. Now, when it comes to the child properties of Flexbox, there's only a few properties that you really have to know, and you're only going to use it occasionally. So flex grow, for example, is if you set this to be 0, it's going to take up the amount of space that you would normally expect it to. But if you click on 1, it's going to grow as much as possible if there's extra space in this element. And we also have flex spaces. So it's very complex on what flex spaces does over width, but it's basically the same thing as width with a few additional properties, and that interacts better with Flexbox. Now I'm going to leave a link in the description if you want to go in depth about flex spaces, but you should always use flex spaces over width when you're using Flexbox. So flex is good for situations like this where there's one dimension, meaning it's either horizontal or vertical. But if you have a section where it's kind of like this, where there is both horizontal and vertical elements, then grid is the better option. Now, even in a situation like this, where we just have a list of items displayed in a gallery-like format, grid is still very easy to implement, and we can just do this in 3 lines of code. However, if we try to use flex, there's actually a problem with using flex in this case. We tend to have no problems with the first line, but the second line, where we have not 3 items, we have 2 items, this becomes a problem. We cannot fix this without some hacky workaround. So let's take a look at another example. So we have a pretty simple layout. This is a common magazine type layout. And over here, we have the code that represents this type of grid. And now if you take a look with the flex, you're going to have to set this flex into 2 separate sections. And then over here, this would be the entire width, and this would be half of that width. Compare that with grid. This will produce the exact same result right here. It's just the code will now be much cleaner. Now, grid is very scary at first because there's so many different options and there's so many different ways to go about using grid, but I want to show you a very simple step-by-step guide on how to approach grid, and there's not a lot of things you actually have to know. So the first step in understanding grid is that we want to split it into the smallest dividable unit for columns. So if we take a look at this example, this particular section where we have this huge grid and we have different varying sizes of boxes, we can take a look at this first row. So we can try and split this into 1 unit, 2 unit, 3 unit, 4 unit. Because these are small boxes, we can say there's 4 columns in this particular grid. But the problem is, if we take a look at this bottom box, this is not going to fit neatly into those particular 4 columns because this kind of overlaps. If you take a look right here, this finishes 3/4 of the way of this particular box. So it doesn't neatly fit into that unit. So what we can do instead is going to divide this into smaller amount of units. And we can say this will be 3 units. So each of these boxes will be 3 units. So that would be a total of 12 columns across. And then we can say this bottom one is now going to be 4 columns. And if we could click on this, we can now see that this first box represents 3 columns and this bottom box represents 4 columns. So that will now work out with this particular grid. And then we can also check the middle one, and this will be 8 units across. And now we can also take a look at the rows. So if we take a look, we're going to have 5 units of rows vertically. So the first row is going to just be 1 unit, but then the second row is going to involve 2 units, and the last one is also going to be 2 units. So that means what we have set up for our grid is that we now have 12 columns of units and then 5 rows of units. And that is what we're going to be using to set up our grid. And then from there, depending on the level of complexity of the design, we are going to use different methods for grids in 3 different scenarios. And I'm going to go through and walk through each type. Now, going back to our admin dashboard, I would consider this a medium level of complexity when we use grid. And the way I determine that is most of the items, there's some consistency in the box sizings, but there are some differences. So we are going to specify each item, and we're going to give each item their own level of units. So the way we start is setting the parent to be display of grid, and then we can use grid template column. So this is going to be the most commonly used property that you'll end up using. And you're going to need to get familiar with the repeat function inside here. And all this means is that we're setting up this to be 12 columns like we mentioned before. And we are going to set each column with the size of 1 fractional unit. Now you can set this to be pixels, and you can change this up depending on what you want. But here, this is pretty simple. So that means we're just dividing based on the number of units that this row has. So it is 1 fractional unit for 12 different columns. So this is basically the width of each column, and this is the total number of columns. And then for the rows, we have grid auto rows. So that means each row, in this case, we're not using template rows, so we don't use units. We're actually setting this to be 150 pixels. So that means this particular row is 150, and since this is 2 units, this is going to be 300 pixels right here for this particular box. And we also set a gap of 20 pixels. That just means 20 pixels spacing in between. And then from here, it's pretty simple. So we can now set the first box. It's going to be a span of 3. We don't need to set grid row to be span of 1 because that's what it is by default. But if we take a look and we go down and we go to row 2, we now have a grid column of span of 8, which represents this particular guy. And then we set a span of 2 for the rows. And then this, as you can guess, is going to be a span of 4, and a grid row is span of 2. And now you can see that this is going to be grid column span of 3 with a span of 2 rows. And as you can see, this is pretty simple. Once you have that unit layout for each column and the number of rows, you can easily set the specified spans to be what you want exactly. It just takes a little bit of effort dividing the number of columns and the number of rows, but once you have that, you have very good control of how much space each element is going to take. Now, before we were doing admin, that had a very consistent level of boxes. So there was a little bit of symmetry and consistency with that layout. But this one right here, we have boxes that span different vertical elements. And I would consider that in a situation where this becomes an advanced complexity for grid. And that's where we are going to use grid template areas. And grid template areas gives us maximum full control, and it also allows us to maintain this type of CSS code very easily. So the way we do this is we're going to set our columns and the rows as usual. Most importantly, we are setting grid template areas. So the way this works is that instead of giving each box or element inside the grid a specific length and height, we are instead specifying kind of like a mini map or a diagram of sorts to identify where things go in the grid. So for example, A, these are consistent. That represents this particular box over here. So A represents this particular element, B represents this one, and then C represents this one. So C is 3 units vertically. And we can see D is over here, and this would be 3 units vertically, E would be 2 units vertically, and then F would be 3 units vertically. But this one would overlap on the 4th row. And we can continue doing the same with GGG, and then HHH would be 4 units vertically with II and JJ. So that allows us to control these elements. And the way we identify each box is we're going to call this grid area. So now all we have to do is we can go to our particular box and go down and specify, this is a custom component that I've created, but this is grid area A. That represents this particular section. And then grid area B represents this, and C represents that. So now we don't actually have to worry about the order of the elements when we place in the components. We can just set this to be the proper grid area. I could call this C instead if I wanted to, and that would just make this one particular C. We could change this like that, and that would just change it up like this. So we would replace those items. So as you can see, it can be a very easy swap with this type of layout. And then we would continue doing the same thing for D, E, F, and then G, H, I, J. And with that, we would have our grid template area for our entire screen. So I highly recommend using grid template areas when you basically have chaos in your layouts. Now, this is kind of an exception, this last type of grid layout. You actually didn't need to set up the smallest dividable unit for columns and rows for this type of situation, which is when you have something like this, as you see in this e-commerce website. This is when all the items or all the children are basically the same width and the same height. So we don't actually need to set up the width or the height or the number of columns or the number of rows. And the way we do this is we just set this to display to be grid, and we can set grid template columns to repeat, and we can set this to be autofill. So it determines the number of columns for us, and we set each column to be 300 pixels. And we can say justify content space around. That determines how the items are going to be laid out. So even in this case, everything is completely responsive without us doing any kind of media queries, which is very, very nice. And just to note, on the children, we don't have to specify anything at all. And that's how you should approach grid. You shouldn't approach by learning all the properties. You should actually approach it by following a step-by-step guide on how to use it, which is much easier. Now, fortunately, with Flexbox and CSS Grid, if you manage to do these correctly, it'll minimize the number of media queries you would have to write. Now, if you take a look at this example, this particular website is mostly done with Flex. So if you have a larger screen, we go to medium-sized screens, and most of it is responsive. So a lot of this will be properly fit into the design, and we don't have to deal with a lot of media queries for medium-sized screens. Now, we still do have to use media queries for smaller screens. So if we go to this size, as you can see, these elements have stacked on top of each other. But fortunately, if we're using Flexbox or Grid, it is quite simple. All we have to do, for example, in this particular section where there is 3 elements and this is flex with space between, all we have to do in the media query is remove the flex, and they'll naturally stack on top of each other. And this is a common pattern that you can do for a lot of different situations where we have flex over here, and all we have to do is remove that flex when the screen has gotten small enough where it's reasonable. Now, sometimes you do have to do some experimentation to figure out where that breakpoint is, but it makes life very easy to do responsive design once you have this layout all set up correctly. Now, after we've talked about flex and grid, and sometimes those are not the best options, then we can resort to absolute and relative positioning as a secondary choice. Absolute is very powerful because you can place it anywhere on the screen, and it's pretty self-explanatory what to do with it. But of course, like I mentioned, should be a secondary option. And a lot of times you use absolute in combination with relative. So absolute and relative positioning are not so common to be using when you're dealing with regular enterprise level applications, whether it's e-commerce or an admin dashboard. A lot of times those are very structural and it has a lot of symmetry. When you're dealing with design websites, like design agencies or landing pages that are extremely fancy, though, like ones you would see on this particular website, awwwawards.com, where they're very design based. For example, like this page, like this particular website, and you have elements that are positioned in very unconventional locations. This is where you would use absolute and relative positioning, because it is very hard to do flex when you have items that are generally in diagonal type formations or they're kind of scattered throughout the entire website. Now, aside from using position absolute and relative for placing items in very tricky situations like we've seen in that designer website, there is a very common occurrence of using position relative and absolute for placing items on top of another item. So if you take a look at this card, right, we have these two buttons that are placed on top of this box. And the way we do this is we set this entire box to be position relative. We also set the image as the child of this entire box, but we have another box that represents a position of absolute. And that is positioned bottom of 10% with the left of 0. And that gives us this particular box element right here. By doing so, we have a very common pattern where we can set the parent with a position of relative and a child of position absolute for any items that we want to place on top of another. And this is another situation over here in this carousel. We can place this item using a parent of position relative on the entire carousel and then child for this particular item over here. Another example can be seen here in this element over here with this image and this outline border that's behind it. And finally, in another example over here, what I'm doing with this particular text that's in the background, we need that text to follow this original over here so that once we move it, this big text is following Evo Gym. So the way to do that is that we are setting the parent element again to relative and a child element that is using a selector called before again and setting that to be absolute, and we position this a little to the top above it and positioning it a little to the left, so we start from over here instead of on this axis. And as you can see, absolute and relative positioning are generally used as a secondary option, especially for functional and application type websites. When it comes to designer-like websites, then you would use it way more frequently. But a lot of times you are developing on more of a functional application, and in those cases, you use relative and absolute positioning as a combination and in sparing usage. And there you go. This is the most comprehensive CSS layout video I've ever done, and I wanted to follow the step-by-step process so you have a foundation or a structure for your CSS layouts, because a lot of people don't teach this fundamental approach to CSS. Instead, they just go through and find little things that they want to change instead of setting up the foundations. Anyways, like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.